Okay, we're going to start notes over World War II. This is going to be part 1. You will watch part 2 the next time. That will be your homework next time we meet. Like I said, this video might be a little bit long, but bear through it. World War II is a very long war. We had just finished talking about fascism and the leaders in Europe in class, and now we're going to actually talk about the start of the war. The world starts to head towards war. Germany and Italy, they were really anxious for military conquest. Like I said, like we talked about in class, a lot of the other nations were really distracted with economic problems, with global depression. Now that Germany and Italy have these new fascist governments, these new nationalist governments, they really wanted military conquest. And we talked about in class, fascism really centers around nationalism and wanting a whole lot of conquest. So that really fits in with that whole fascism idea. The Japanese businesses were invested in Manchuria, which is in northern China. These were really rich in iron and coal. What happens is Japanese goes in, invades China, and takes Manchuria. And this happens despite the objections from many of the people in Japanese parliament. The Japanese army goes in and sets up a puppet government in Manchuria. We kind of talked about this a little bit in class, but I'm just going to re-go over it. So they go in, they invade China, and this invasion of China was the first violation of the League of Nations. So the League was like, protested this invasion. They said Japan went against the agreement, but Japan withdraws from the League of Nations in 1933. And you remember we talked about the nations in Europe and Asia. The first thing is between Japan and China, and we had talked about that Japan goes in and they invade Manchuria. They withdraw from the League of Nations. But something happens in July 7th, 1937. There's a border dispute between the Japanese and the Chinese troops. There's a battle that breaks out, and it's at Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing. And this was kind of like the opening of the undeclared war between Japan and China. And what ends up happening is the Japanese troops are able to take over Beijing. They're able to take Nanjing, and Japan has really big victories in China. It kind of shows their strength. Mussolini also has some aggression that leads to war, that leads to show he's wanting to get more land. He orders an attack on Ethiopia in 1935. What he does, he basically he sends his troops down into Ethiopia, and he's able to conquer that territory for Italy. The Ethiopian government appeals to the League of Nations, but the League of Nations doesn't really do anything about it. There was really nothing that they did. So the Italians were able to conquer Ethiopia, and it kind of shows that the League of Nations is ineffective and it's not really out to do what it said it was going to do. Another act of aggression on the part of the Germans was Hitler refuses to enforce and uphold the Treaty of Versailles. And we talked about that in class a little bit, about how that was a lot of what his ideology was based on, is the overturning of the Treaty of Versailles. And because of this, the League of Nations kind of condemns him mildly, kind of gives him a slap on the wrist, but it really wasn't any enforcement. And this kind of encourages Hitler, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and press forward, and I'm going to continue on with my plan, because Hitler, being a fascist, wanted to glorify the nation and glorify the state, so he's going to want to expand his borders. The last thing that kind of acts as an act of aggression is Hitler enters the Rhineland, which was just an area in Germany that borders France that had been demilitarized after World War I. But he sends troops over into the Rhineland, which kind of scare the French because he's sending troops to their borders, and it makes them really nervous. But the British, they urge an appeasement policy. And appeasement is just giving in to the enemy to keep peace. Instead of attacking the Germans for doing that, or calling them out, the British are just encouraging, just let them be, let them do what they need to do, or let them do what they will in order to keep peace, because peace was so important at this time. In the aftermath of World War I, that's what they were focused on. Hitler entering the Rhineland was a huge turning point in the march towards war. First of all, it strengthens Hitler's power. It shows that he has enough power to go into the Rhineland, and the other nations are not going to do anything. It also places that balance of power into Hitler's favor. He's able to kind of now have a leg up. The French and the Allies after World War I kind of were more powerful. They had placed all the blame on the Germans, but now that balance of power had shifted into German favor. And the weak response by the others, the British and the French, the fact that they weren't upset and didn't do anything about it, kind of encouraged Hitler to go ahead and build up his military and follow through with his territory gains. After this, Mussolini decides that he's going to create an alliance with Germany. And this is called the Rome-Berlin Axis, which eventually becomes the Axis powers made up of Japan, Italy, and Germany. And this is who is fighting in World War II, the Axis powers versus the Allied powers. And the Axis powers are made up of Japan, Italy, and Germany, with the Allied powers being Great Britain, France for a short while, the United States eventually, and the Soviet Union. Another thing that happens in Europe that kind of sparks aggression or makes the other countries nervous is the German and Italian troops aid Spain in their civil war, and they are aiding in favor of a fascist ruler named Franco Francisco. Spain was in the midst of a civil war for their government, and there was a fascist ruler named Franco Francisco who was coming into rule, and German and Italian troops go into Spain and help Francisco to come to power in Spain. So that was another act toward war and aggression in Europe. This is just a map of the Rhineland, as you can see right here. It's just this land right here. Here is France, and here is Germany. And this just kind of made the French very nervous that Hitler was stationed and that he sent his troops there to the Rhineland. Basically, Britain and France didn't do anything. They didn't stand up to the fascist rulers they wanted to keep peace. They fell into that appeasement policy. They wanted to do anything and fall into anything, make sure that they appeased those rulers. At this time, the Americans were practicing isolationism, and this was the belief that political ties to another nation should be avoided. They passed the Neutrality Acts, and this is what they hoped would keep them out of wars. They made it illegal to sell arms or lend money to any nations that were at war, and they thought that if they had passed these acts, then they would stay out of war and hopefully avoid another world war. In 1937, Hitler announces his plan to absorb Austria and Czechoslovakia into the Third Reich. And the Third Reich was just the German Empire. Hitler wanted to unify Germany into one single homeland. So he announces he's going to absorb Poland and Russia. The Treaty of Versailles prohibited this. This was called an Anschluss, or a union between Austria and Germany. They prohibited that, and but Britain and France, again, they don't do anything. In 1938, Germany enters Austria and annexes it. The Germans then try to move into Czechoslovakia, which was just become an independent nation after World War I, and Hitler and the Germans demand what is known as the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland is just a land on the western border of Germany and Czechoslovakia that's made up of German-speaking people that Hitler wants to absorb. Hitler tries to get these lands, but the Czechs refuse to give in. They refuse to give Hitler this land. Basically what happens is the Czechs refuse to give in, and they turn to Great Britain and France for help. Here's a map of the Sudetenland. It's just this western border here of Germany. There are some over here, but it's mainly this western border between Czechoslovakia and Germany that the Germans want to absorb. What happens is Mussolini suggests that Germany, France, Britain, and Italy meet together in Munich at the Munich Conference. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, he wants to preserve peace, so he continues to practice appeasement, and he gives in to Hitler's demands. What happens is Hitler is allowed to take the Sudetenland, and he is forced to honor Czechoslovakia's new borders, meaning he can't go in and absorb Czechoslovakia as a whole. He can just take the Sudetenland. Basically, he doesn't uphold that. Less than 6 months after the Munich conference, German troops go in and take Czechoslovakia. They absorb Czechoslovakian land. Mussolini takes Albania, and the Germans start to demand the Polish port of Danzig. When he demands the Polish port of Danzig, the Polish ask for British and French aid, but Hitler, at this time, he knew, spelling error, he knew that appeasement would keep Britain and France out of war. He knew that he could play on this policy of appeasement, that the British and the French were so bent on keeping peace that he pretty much could get away with anything. So Hitler had a definite advantage because the British and the French were wanting to practice appeasement. They wanted to keep peace. So they kept giving in to Hitler's demands, allowing him to expand Germany's borders and gain more territory. Britain and France, they try to appeal to the Soviet Union. And like we talked about in class, the Soviet Union is Russia. They want to stop Hitler, but this was difficult. They didn't necessarily trust the new communist government. They didn't. Stalin was upset about being left out of the Munich conference. So the negotiations went very slowly. While the British and French are negotiating with Stalin, at the same time, Hitler and the Soviet Union, they get together and they sign a non-aggression pact. And this was a pact that just said that Germany and the Soviet Union would never invade each other. Basically, Germany would never invade the Soviet Union and vice versa. However, they also decide that they're going to split Poland among each other, that Germany will have the western portion of Poland, and Russia will get, or the USSR, Soviet Union, will take possession of the eastern portion of Poland. So after this non-aggression pact is signed, Hitler starts to move forward to take his share of Poland. In September 1st, 1939, German planes invade the Polish airspace, tanks go across the Polish border, and they bomb Warsaw, Poland mercilessly. And this is like the first act of war on the European continent that basically signals the start of World War II. Because Hitler moves forward and starts to conquer Poland, Britain and France declare war on Germany September 3rd, 1939, and they try to go to the aid of Poland. They are not able to do that. They're not able to get military arms down into Poland soon enough. Poland falls to Germany 3 weeks later. The importance of this is after the German invasion of Poland, World War II has officially started. The Polish invasion, it was the first example of the German strategy, the Blitzkrieg. You probably have heard of Blitzkrieg before. It just means lightning war, and that just meant that the Germans were going to use a very fast surprise attack strategy using planes and tanks and large infantry to kind of dominate their opponents. On September 17th, Stalin starts to occupy the eastern part of Poland, and he starts to annex regions that he was promised with Hitler. He starts to occupy eastern part of Poland. He's able to annex Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. He goes into Finland, and they have a battle in Finland, but Finland eventually falls to Stalin after a long winter war in 1940. British and French troops were stationed along the Maginot Line, waiting for Germans to attack. And the Maginot Line was just a system of forts that had been in place between the French and German border after World War I. It was kind of a fortification that was set there so that in protection from the Germans after World War I. So they sat at this Maginot Line waiting for the Germans to attack them. The Germans occupied what they had with their line, the Siegfried Line, and it pretty much was a duel. They were staring back and forth at each other. The Germans kind of coined it the Sitzkrieg, or the sitting war, or they called it the phony war, because nothing was happening. There really wasn't any action. But this peace ends when the Germans invade Denmark and Norway, and they fall to Germany. After this, Hitler sweeps across Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and he's trying to strike at France. He sends tanks through the Ardennes, which is an area through France and Luxembourg, and they are able to squeeze through the Maginot Line and enter France. The Germans are able to trap the Allied forces around the French city of Lille, and German victory looked like it was going to happen. France was falling very quickly. The Belgium surrendered to the Germans, and the Allies and the French escaped to the French port city of Dunkirk. Because of this, the British tried to help the French retreat. They sent about 850 ships to French aid. It was kind of a makeshift armada. They sent paddle boats, they sent passenger ships, naval ships, anything they had to go to the French aid. This makeshift armada was able to bring about 338,000 soldiers to safety, but the fall of France was pretty inevitable. This is called the Miracle at Dunkirk, where they were able to help some of the French soldiers retreat. However, after Dunkirk, France seems destined for defeat. Italy comes and they join forces with the Germans, and they declare war on Great Britain and France. Italy comes in and attacks France in the south, and the Germans are able to take Paris. At this time, because they knew they were about to fall, they were going to fall to the Germans, the French asked Henri Pétain to become the Prime Minister of France. On June 22nd, 1940, the French surrender, and the Germans take control of northern France, and a puppet government controlled by the Germans is installed in southern France. A French general named Charles de Gaulle, he flees to London, where he sets up his own government in exile, and he pretty much commits himself to reconquering France and liberating France from German rule. He establishes the Free French military force that fights Nazis in World War II. So France is now taken over by the Germans, and it's under German control. At this point, it's pretty much the British standing alone against German forces. Like I said, Great Britain, now it stands alone against the Nazis. The French are now have fallen. They are under German control. The new prime minister, we talked about him in class, Winston Churchill, he vowed to never give in. He wanted to defeat the Nazis at all costs. Now, Hitler has the mindset, he's taken over France, France has fallen to his reign. Now he has the mindset of invading Great Britain. And he has his operation called Operation Sea Lion, where he plans to knock out the Royal Air Force, and he lands 250,000 soldiers on England's shores. He does this by using his Air Force, Luftwaffe, and he bombs Great Britain. He targets airfield and aircraft factories, and then starts to turn his focus towards cities, especially London, trying to defeat and tear down the morale of the people. And he goes in with all these air raids. However, the Royal Air Force has some secret weapons. They use an electronic tracking system called a radar, which we know what a radar is, to detect German planes. And they also use a code-breaking device called Enigma to break German secret code messages. So with those two pieces of technology, the radar and the decoding device, they are able to kind of stand up to the Germans. The Battle of Britain rages on until May 19th, 1941, until Hitler calls off all of his attacks on Great Britain. The British were able to stand up to Hitler, and he's able to, the Royal Air Force is able to kind of ward off defeat. This is really important. The Battle of Britain is important. First of all, it was the use of the radar that was able to help them to defeat the Germans. Also, after the Battle of Britain, Hitler decides to take all of his attention to Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. He decides to take his focus off of Britain, and he moves his attention to the Eastern Front. Also, the Allies learned that Hitler can be stopped. So this was some important information, and it was kind of a turning point in the fact that now Hitler no longer has his sights set on conquering Great Britain like he had conquered France. In the Eastern Front, Germany's first goal was in the Mediterranean, North Africa in particular. In North Africa, Mussolini ordered his North African army to move east from Libya into the British-owned Egypt. Now let's remember, guys, a lot of Africa was owned by European nations. Egypt was owned by the British. Egypt is in possession of the Suez Canal, which was a very, very crucial passageway in getting oil and reaching oil fields in the Middle East. So what happens, the Italian troops start to move into British-owned Egypt, and the British strike back. The British sweep about 500 miles across North Africa. They take 130,000 prisoners, but Hitler steps in, and he sends one of his best generals, eventually known as Desert Fox, General Erwin Rommel, to command the Tank Corps, or the Afrika Corps, in northern Africa. Rommel attacks the British at Agela, and the British are forced to retreat about 500 miles to the city of Tobruk. There was a huge battle at Tobruk, and the British are able to force Erwin Rommel back to where he started. By June, though, however, the tide had shifted, and Rommel and the Germans were able to push the British back, and they were able to seize Tobruk. So this North African loss was a huge blow for the Allies. It was a back and forth battle, and they were battling in North Africa, but Erwin Rommel, or the Desert Fox, was able to seize Tobruk and defeat the Allies in North Africa. He was very active in the Balkans. Hitler began in 1940 to plan an attack on the USSR, or Soviet Union, which he had signed the non-aggression pact with Stalin. However, he was ignoring that pact. He was going to go ahead and pose an invasion on the Soviets, but he needed to build some bases. So he chose the Balkans and southeastern Europe to kind of serve as his buffer and build bases. Immediately, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, they joined the Axis powers. They give in to Hitler, and they didn't want any kind of German aggression. However, Yugoslavia and Greece resist. Hitler attacks the nations, and they fall to German rule. So now that he has got possession over these Balkan nations, he's ready to attack the Soviet Union. The attack on the Soviet Union was known as Operation Barbarossa. And in Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941, the Germans launch a blitzkrieg invasion on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Red Army was not ready for their attack. They were not prepared. And the Germans were able to push 500 miles into the massive Soviet Union. The Russians used the same tactic they used against Napoleon. If you'll see some parallels here, guys, you can remember when Napoleon attacked Russia, they used what's known as the scorched earth policy. They basically burn and destroy everything in the enemy's path, any land, any livestock, anything that the enemy might want, they go ahead and burn it. So they used this policy, but by September 8th, the Germans surrounded the city of Leningrad, and they cut the city off from the rest of the world. They tried to starve the city by destroying their food storages, warehouses. People were starving. They were eating cow feed. They were eating horse feed. They were eventually started eating crows, and they started eating rats. And then the Germans start to move toward Moscow. By December, Hitler had reached Moscow, but the Soviets at this point counterattacked. Now, this was December, and you can remember that the same thing that happened to Napoleon is going to happen to Hitler. The winter. The winter was very harsh in Russia, and the Russians were used to it, and the Germans were not prepared. The Germans started to retreat. They were freezing. They had not prepared for any winter. They didn't think the siege was going to take this long, but Hitler sends the word to not retreat. So the Germans dug in about 125 miles from Moscow, and they stay until March 1943. About 500,000 Germans died in this as a result of Operation Barbarossa. But the Soviets, same tactics as they had with Napoleon, the winter was on their side. At this point, the United States was still very apprehensive about joining the war. You remember we talked about the neutrality acts that were passed. But the FDR, the President of the United States, we've talked about him in class, he knew that if the Allies were to fall, if any of the Allies were to fall, then the United States would be drawn into the war. So he issues the Lend-Lease Act. And the Lend-Lease Act was basically the president could lend or lease any arms, any supplies to countries that were vital to the United States. And by 1941, the British had taken advantage of this Lend-Lease Act, and U.S. ships were escorting British ships carrying U.S. arms. Because of this, Hitler ordered the sinking of any cargo ships that he met. By this time, Churchill and Roosevelt, they met in secret at Newfoundland, which is up in Canada, and they signed the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter basically upheld free trade among nations and the right for people to choose their own government. They just wanted to uphold that idea that had been established after World War I. By September 4th, the German U-boats had fired on a U.S. destroyer in the Atlantic, and the United States kind of got involved in an undeclared naval war with Germany. So there were shots fired between the Germans and the Americans, but the real attack comes from Japan in the Pacific. We're going to kind of shift our attention here from the European side. We're going to shift the war to the Pacific theater. Japan was another force in the war. We haven't talked much about them, but now we will. Japan, as we talked about, was upset that they did not have much land acquisition after World War I. They wanted to expand their empire into Southeast Asia, into those European colonies. They wanted to be a force there. This posed a threat to the American colonies of Philippines and Guam. You remember we talked about in class, after the Spanish-American War, the Americans got possession of the Philippines and Guam. The United States government sent some aid to strengthen the Chinese resistance against the Japanese, and they cut off oil supply to Japan when they were able to conquer French Indochina. The Japanese started to plan massive attacks on Southeast Asia. They started to plan to conquer this land. And the naval strategist Isoroku Yamamoto, he did not like the United States occupying Hawaii, which was at Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor. It was very famous. Franklin Delano Roosevelt got on the radio and named it the date that will live in infamy. At this attack, the Japanese were able to damage 18 ships, 8 battleships, killed 2,400 Americans, and wounded about 1,000 Americans. It left the United States naval fleet left the United States naval fleet very slighted. They did not have as many battleships anymore. It was just a very monumental attack. We all know it as the attack that brought the United States into World War II. This is just a picture from a distance of the Pearl Harbor attacks. And as you can see, it was at the very beginning of when the Japanese came to attack Pearl Harbor. Japanese, they start to post strikes at the United States in the Pacific. They were able to seize Guam, Wake Island. They attacked the Philippines, the British islands of Malaya. They were able to take Hong Kong, the Midway Islands, Thailand. They were just a huge, powerful force in the Pacific. They were going in and they were taking these Pacific islands because they didn't like the European influence in the Pacific in Southeast Asia. They kind of wanted to keep Asia for the Asians. So Japan proved to be a major force. They almost seemed unstoppable in Southeast Asia. Because the Japanese seemed unbeatable, the Allies wanted to strike back. So the United States sent Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle to bomb Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The bombs didn't do very much damage, but they proved that the Japanese could be attacked. Doolittle's raid, it boosted American morale, and the Allies began to turn the tide of war. The Battle of the Coral Sea, the Americans were able to intercept the Japanese attack that was on Port Moresby in New Guinea. And the Allies lost more ships, but the battle was somewhat of a draw. It was a naval battle. The Japanese claimed victory, but the Allies had stopped a Japanese attack on New Guinea. The tide for the Allies really turns at the Battle of Midway. And Japan had targeted this battle, or this island, which was home to a United States airfield. The United States was using a coding system, and they knew that 150 ships were headed toward the Battle of Midway. The United States, they hid out, and they allowed the Japanese to make the first strike, and they were outnumbered because they had lost ships in Pearl Harbor, but they were able to defeat the Japanese Navy. And at the Battle of Midway, this turned the tide of war in favor of the Allies in the Pacific Theater. And when we say Pacific Theater, I mean in the Pacific Front. That's what it's called, the Pacific Theater. So after the Battle of Midway, the tide had kind of turned from a dominant Japanese force to more of an Allied force in the Pacific. This changes the strategy. General Douglas MacArthur for the United States, he was the commander of the Allies in the Pacific. He believed that if they stormed each island, that would be really long and costly. So each island in the Pacific, storming each island would cost a lot of lives, cost a lot of supplies. So he believed in island hopping, and this was an idea. He agreed that they should hop from island to island past the Japanese strong point. After he would take the islands, he would use air power to cut off their supplies and starve them, and this strategy was very beneficial to the Americans. At the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Japanese were building a huge air base on the Solomon Islands. And what happens is 19,000 Marines land at Guadalcanal, and the Japanese are totally taken it by surprise. The Allies are able to take the airfield, but they engage in a brutal 6-month battle for the island. The Japanese eventually abandon the island, and they rename it the Island of Death, and the United States is victorious, or the Allies, I should say. The United States were the instigators, but the Allies are victorious in the Battle of Guadalcanal.